Pretty cool, huh?
Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа Ushanka Show. And as you may have guessed already, today we're going to talk about Soviet watches. But before we begin, I would like to read you a small part of my new book that I'm working on right now, American Diaries 1996, and it's called Made in Hong Kong, and it's about Soviet watches, of course. Made in Hong Kong. Since I was a little kid, I always wanted to have a wristwatch. It was probably an unconscious desire to look cool and more mature. There was no hope that my parents would buy me a Polyot or Vostok timepiece, since watches were quite pricey, especially after my family opted to purchase a so-called cooperative three-room apartment back in 1981 instead of waiting for 20-some years for a free two-room flat. A footnote: while many people called state-owned housing free, it wasn't really free. People had to pay monthly rent based on the size of an apartment and weren't allowed to sell it. Cooperative apartments were expensive. Ours was almost 15,000 rubles and required a hefty 30% down payment, with the remainder paid in installments for the following 15 years. That Soviet mortgage was consuming almost a quarter of my family's income, leaving hardly any spare cash by the end of the month. My grandpa Sergei owned a vintage 1958 Pobeda wristwatch with a black dial and golden hands, which he kept in his desk drawer and wore only on special occasions. I begged him many times to give me the watch as a birthday present, but to no avail. "Maybe next year," was his standard reply. "If you have good grades, of course." While I was drooling over Soviet-made Pobeda, well-to-do comrades like butchers, waiters, and taxi drivers, among the others, considered made-in-Japan Orient, Seiko, or Citizen quartz watches as the ultimate status symbol. Those had to be smuggled into our socialist paradise by enterprising sailors. In the mid-80s, digital watches from Hong Kong took the Soviet Union by storm. Most popular brand was Montana, and it featured a large LCD display, nightlight, alarm, timer, and, oh my goodness, 16 melodies. This function really knocked the socks off anyone. The watch also carried a hefty price tag of 50 rubles, almost half of the average monthly salary. Not many people in the USSR could afford that. Only when I became a student of Kiev Polytechnic Institute, I finally was able to buy that watch using my generous stipend of 50 rubles per month. It took me a while to stop constantly playing those 16 melodies and draining down the battery. I enjoyed my cool watch very much for several years. Unfortunately, one day I got caught in a terrible downpour on the way from college. Everything got soaked, including my precious watch. Its screen went blank. Ever since then, my Montana was never the same. Even a small amount of moisture, like morning fog or just a sweaty arm, often caused the watch to turn itself off or simply reset the time back to 000000, making me miss several important alarms. Okay, so that was a short excerpt of my book, American Diaries 1996. And I actually found that Grandpa's watch Pobeda on Etsy.com. I'm not sure if I'm ready to spend $70 to $100 people asking for that model, but that's exactly the watch that I recall. Black faced and golden numbers and little tiny seconds circle on the bottom. But yeah, that was the watch my grandpa had forever, and he always promised me that maybe next year I'll have it. But it's only came to me, I believe, when he passed away, and at that time it wasn't functional. Okay, so Soviet watches. One of the items that we didn't have a real shortage was watches. They weren't cheap. The cheapest watch will be around $30 to $40, and then of course they go up from there. And we didn't really have luxury brands. Every watch was just a proletarian watch, right? Some of them were better quality, some were not as good. But speaking of the luxury watches, as I mentioned in my story, in the early 80s, that's when made in Japan, Orient, Seiko, and Citizen watches, they started coming into the Soviet Union, being smuggled in. So a lot of those watches came through Afghanistan. So when the Soviet soldiers went on their peacekeeping mission in Afghanistan, special military operation back then, they brought back chewing gum, Levi's jeans, and they brought Orient watches, which considered like that was the best thing you can find and get, but those were extremely expensive. People sell them based on their greed from 200 rubles to 300 rubles per watch, so you pay 2 monthly salaries for a nice watch. And quite a few came that way to the Soviet Union because now on the secondary market there's a tons of different Orient watches. I didn't realize that that company is still in business and they're actually doing pretty well. But among the Soviet watches, the most desirable watch was made by Chistopolsky Chasovoi Zavod Vostok. So that's the watch factory from Chistopolsk in Tatarstan. Originally, that factory was located in Moscow and it was called Second Moscow Watch Factory. But in 1941, after the war broke out with Nazi Germany, this factory was relocated to Tatarstan and that's where it remained. It was named Vostok since 1969. Fun fact, both Moscow watch factories, so first and second Moscow watch factories, that was the names, Первый Московский часовой завод and Второй Московский часовой, they were equipped with American watchmaking equipment. So somehow, I guess during the first or second 5-year plan, Stalin imported from the United States equipment to make watches. So generally the most desirable brands and the most reliable brands in the Soviet Union were made by Chistopolsky watch factory, and that's what those Commandirsky and Amphibia watches, they were like the coolest you could get. And definitely that'll be an interesting topic to dig in and research about what kind of equipment was purchased from United States, watchmaking equipment, as well as after the end of World War II, there was a German watchmaking equipment which was confiscated and transferred to the Soviet Union. I couldn't find which factories utilized German equipment, but we have United States watchmaking equipment and German watchmaking equipment still working hard in modern Russia. The watch Победа, which means victory, that I mentioned in my story, was made at Petrozavodski Chasovoi Zavod, so the watch factory located in Petrozavodsk. The name of that factory was Raketa, the rocket, and brand Победа was introduced after the end of the Great Patriotic War. So we won, so Победа, and that's the brand that my grandpa had forever. Also, that factory produced one of the cheapest watches called Raketa, and they sold around 4.5 million watches per year in the 80s. That Moscow watch factory that remained got the name Slava, Glory, so that was another popular brand of watches that you could buy everywhere in the Soviet Union, Slava. In Minsk, the capital of Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, we had a Minsky Chasovoi Zavod, Minsk watch factory. It was called Luch, which can be translated as the beam of light, right? Luch. And they produced that brand of watches. Luch, those were like $30, $40 inexpensive watches and sold in millions as well. And here you see the page from my father workbook, so Трудовая книжка, and a page about rewards and bonuses. Looks like I cut out the date. Sometimes in late 70s he was награжден ценным подарком часами Луч. So he was awarded with valuable present Luch watches. And I'm not sure if he still had those. So this is one of the way people were rewarded. Instead of money, they'll get a watch. Among other popular Soviet brands of watches, we should mention Полет. So that's the flight. Moskva, of course, it's Moscow. Watches Mir, which means peace. And alarm clocks Yantarь. Looks like that factory located in Oryol, Soviet Russia, was specializing only in alarm clocks. And I remember buying one of those in the early 80s, and mine was battery operated. And if you ask me a question about how good were the Soviet watches, I looked it up and people have different opinions. Some think they were the best watches in the world, even in a level of Swiss-made watches. Some people claim they were junk. It looks like the Komandirsky brand and Amphibia were like the most reliable because they were like military-grade watches. The rest were just okay. I recall seeing a lot of repair shops for the watches back in my day. So there was a lot of business fixing watches and they were pretty pricey. People want to just throw away like Chinese watches these days. So mixed feelings again about those watches. They definitely look cool now. And maybe one day I'll be brave enough to pull the trigger and buy that black-faced Победа watch of my grandpa that I wanted so bad. Well, my friends, that's all I have for you today. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed this video. As always, please don't forget to like this video. It helps it to move up in a Google search, which Google have a problem with promoting my videos. And we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.
Sergey wrote a book based on diaries he made when he was first in the United States. And as I understand, this is just volume 1, right?
That's correct.
He's going to have multiple volumes coming out. Well, I said, well, since Sergey is kind enough to come up and speak with us, I bought the book. I said, I might as well read this. I read this in one sitting. 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I just couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating because your writing is very compelling, for one. And his story is very interesting for two. It's really interesting. You know, we've lived here our whole lives. We don't have that perspective. It's just so interesting to hear someone else's perspective about what we take for granted. So I hope you really tune in and listen to what he has to say. It's a very interesting, very informed perspective. Sergey is not a historian. He's an electrical engineer by trade, but I find that he has a depth of understanding on history, economics, culture. So just a very observant fellow and a great storyteller. So like